Okay, everyone, welcome back to our next lecture in this chapter, and this is going over the female reproductive system. This lecture is definitely going to be a little bit longer because the female reproductive system is slightly more complicated and it does a few more things than the male reproductive system. So let's get right into it. First, an introduction. The female reproductive system functions to produce gametes and reproductive hormones just like the male reproductive system. However, it also has the additional task of supporting the developing fetus and eventually delivering it to the outside world. Unlike in the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system is located primarily inside of the pelvic cavity. The ovaries are the female gonads, and the gamete they produced is called an oocyte and eventually an egg. So the external female genitals first. The external female reproductive structures are referred to collectively as the vulva. So this is sometimes where colloquially we get this wrong, where we call sort of the entire subset of the genitalia the vagina. But what you'll see is that the vagina is actually only a small, relatively small inner portion of the entire subset. And so everything that's external, collectively we call it the vulva. The first that I'll talk about is the mons pubis, which is a pad of fat that's located at the anterior over the pubic bone. The labia majora, labia meaning lips, and majora meaning larger, are folds of skin that begin just posterior to the mons pubis, and then we have the thinner, more pigmented labia minora, smaller lips, that extend medial to the labia majora, and they serve to protect the female urethra and the entrance to the female reproductive tract. The superior and anterior portions of the labia minora come together to encircle the clitoris, or glans clitoris. If you remember, glans penis was an organ that originates from some cells, and these are the same cells that make the glans clitoris. And just like the glans penis, it has an abundant set of nerves, and it makes it important in sexual sensation and orgasm. Then we have a structure called the hymen, which is a thin membrane that sometimes can partially cover the entrance of the vagina. Important to know here, contrary to some sort of beliefs, an intact hymen cannot be used as an indication of virginity. In fact, the hymen is never fully covering any opening. It is only partially covering, and it can be torn a number of ways, not just through penile insertion. And so that's just something that we need to start dispelling in sort of our everyday thought. The vaginal opening, the entrance into the vagina, it's located between the opening of the urethra and the anus. It is flanked by outlets to what are called Bartholin's glands, or the greater vestibular glands, which secrete some mucus that basically keeps the entire area well lubricated. And let's get into the vagina. The vagina is a muscular canal, approximately 10 centimeters long, and it serves as the entrance to the reproductive tract. It also serves as the exit from the uterus during both menses, or menstruation, and childbirth. When we look at the walls of the vagina, they are lined with an outer fibrous adventitia, which is a middle layer of smooth muscle, and an inner mucous membrane with transverse folds called rugae. Together, the middle and inner layers allow the expansion of the vagina to accommodate intercourse and, of course, childbirth, which is obviously quite a feat. The vagina is home to a normal population of microorganisms, like bacteria, that help to protect against infection by pathogenic bacteria that can cause infections, yeast, or other organisms that can enter the vagina. In a healthy woman, the most predominant type of vaginal bacteria is from the genus Lactobacillus. That family of bacteria secretes lactic acid, and it protects the vagina this way because lactic acid maintains an acidic pH below 4.5. It's very acidic. But these potential pathogens are going to be very less likely to survive in those acidic conditions. So the combination of lactic acid and the other vaginal secretions actually makes the vagina a self-cleansing organism. And in fact, it is recommended that no external cleaning is done into the vagina. So no, they call that douching, and that is actually not recommended because the vagina is a self-cleansing organ, and to insert any cleansing products into the vagina actually opens up the possibility, the window for these other organisms that could cause some serious infections. The next are the ovaries, and just like the testes, this is where your gametes will be produced in a woman. They are the female gonads. They're very small, about 2 to 3 centimeters in length, which is about the size of an almond. They are located within the pelvic cavity, of course, and are supported by what is called the mesovarium, which is an extension of the peritoneum, and that connects the ovaries to the broad ligament. Extending from the mesovarium itself is a suspensory ligament that contains ovarian blood vessels and lymph vessels. And finally, the ovary itself, there's two of them, is attached to the uterus via the ovarian ligament. Okay? The ovary comprises an outer covering of cuboidal epithelium called the ovarian surface epithelium. It's superficial to a dense connective tissue covering called the tunica albuginea. Beneath the tunica albuginea is the cortex, or outer portion of the ovary, and the cortex is composed of tissue framework called the ovarian stroma that forms the bulk of the adult ovary. Oocytes develop within the outer layer of the stroma, each surrounded by supporting cells. This grouping of an oocyte and a supporting cell is called a follicle. If you remember follicle stimulating hormone, we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's talk about the ovarian cycle. This is not to be confused with the menstrual cycle. The ovarian cycle is a set of predictable changes in a female's oocytes and ovarian follicles. During a woman's reproductive years, which is from puberty, beginning of puberty, to the end, which is called menopause, it is a roughly 28-day cycle that can be correlated with, but is, of course, not the same, like I said, as the menstrual cycle. This cycle includes two interrelated processes: oogenesis, or some people call it oogenesis, so I call it oogenesis, the production of female gametes, and folliculogenesis, which is the growth and development of ovarian follicles. Let's talk about oogenesis, which is the production of egg cells, which are the female gametes. The process begins with the ovarian stem cells, or oogonia. Remember, this is very, very similar to the beginning of production of sperm, spermatogenesis. You have stem cells. The oogonia are formed during fetal development and divide via mitosis, much like spermatogonia in the testes. Unlike spermatogonia, however, oogonia form primary oocytes in the fetal ovary prior to birth. So this is happening before the child is ever born. These primary oocytes are then arrested, or they basically stop in this stage of meiosis 1, only to resume it at the beginning of puberty, 13, 14, 15 years later, and continuing until the end of a woman's reproductive life, which is called menopause. The number of primary oocytes during the ovaries declines from about 1 to 2 million in an infant to approximately 400,000 at puberty, and of course, once we hit menopause, to 0. Ovulation. So ovulation, to initiate ovulation, which is the release of an oocyte from the ovary, marks the transition from puberty into reproductive maturity for women. From then on, throughout a woman's reproductive years, ovulation occurs approximately once every 28 days. Just prior to ovulation, you get a surge of that luteinizing hormone, and that triggers the resumption of meiosis in one of those primary oocytes that was frozen in time from before birth. That initiates this transition from a primary oocyte to secondary oocyte. That cell division does not result in two identical cells like we saw in spermatogenesis, but instead what you'll see, and when I show you the diagram, is that the cytoplasm is actually divided unequally, and one daughter cell is much larger than the other. The larger cell, which is called the secondary oocyte, eventually leaves the ovary during ovulation. The smaller, which are called polar bodies, or one is called a polar body, will eventually just disintegrate. Meiosis of the secondary oocyte is completed only if a sperm succeeds in penetrating its barriers. Meiosis 2 then resumes, and we know that that is just basically meiosis 2 basically is a mitotic division of a haploid cell. And what it will produce is one haploid ovum that at the instant of fertilization by a haploid sperm becomes the first diploid cell of the new offspring, which we call a zygote. And then that ovum can be thought of as a brief transitional haploid stage between the diploid oocyte and a diploid zygote. So here's a picture. So you can think of this line, everything here is happening before birth, where we have this stem cell oogonium go through a meiosis to make a primary oocyte and a secondary oocyte. The primary oocyte returns to be an oogonium. This is all very, very similar to spermatogenesis. Then meiosis 1 will begin, but it is arrested or basically paused until we hit puberty. Once the female hits puberty, then meiosis 1 resumes. Remember, in meiosis 1, we go from a diploid cell to a haploid cell. You can see here that it becomes the secondary oocyte. This is the primary, which is the polar body. The secondary is larger, and that will continue on and eventually to become basically the egg cell that can then join with a sperm, and the other become polar bodies that eventually just disintegrate. Okay, so folliculogenesis is the second part of this. Folliculogenesis begins with follicles in a resting state. These small primordial follicles are present in newborn females and are the prevailing follicle type in the adult ovary. Primordial follicles have only a single flat layer of support cells, we call them granulosa cells, that surround them, and they can stay in that resting state for years, some right up until before menopause. After puberty, though, a few of these primordial follicles will respond to a recruitment signal each day, and they'll join a pool of immature growing follicles called primary follicles. Those primary follicles start with a single layer of granulosa cells that become active and transition from a flat squamous shape to a rounded cuboidal shape as they increase in size and they proliferate. As those cells divide, the follicles, which are now called secondary follicles, increase in diameter, adding a new outer layer of connective tissue, blood vessels, and theca cells, which are cells that work with the granulosa cells to produce estrogens, which is the female sex steroid hormone. Within the growing secondary follicle, the primary oocyte will now secrete a thin acellular membrane called the zona pellucida, and that will play a critical role in fertilization. A thick fluid called follicular fluid that will have formed between the granulosa cells also begins to collect into one large pool called an antrum. Follicles in which the antrum has become large and fully formed are considered tertiary follicles or antral follicles. Several follicles will reach that stage at the same time, but most of them will undergo atresia, which is basically just breakdown of those follicles. But there will be one that will not die, and that will continue to grow and develop until ovulation, when it will expel its secondary oocyte, surrounded by several layers of granulosa cells from the ovary. Keep in mind, most follicles don't make it to that point. In fact, 99% of the follicles in the ovary will undergo atresia, which can occur at any stage of folliculogenesis. Okay, so how do we control this ovarian cycle through hormones? The process of going from primordial follicle to early tertiary follicle takes approximately 2 months in humans, and then the final stages of development of a small cohort of those tertiary follicles ends with ovulation of a secondary oocyte, and that occurs over a course of approximately 28 days. Those changes are regulated by many of the same hormones that regulate male reproductive system, including GnRH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Just like in men, the hypothalamus produces GnRH. It's the hormone that signals to the anterior pituitary gland to produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. FSH will stimulate the follicles to grow, right? That's what it says in its name. And the 5 or 6 tertiary follicles will begin expanding in diameter. The release of luteinizing hormone also stimulates the granulosa and thecal cells to produce the sex steroid hormone estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. That phase of the ovarian cycle, when the tertiary follicles are growing and secreting estrogen, is called the follicular phase. The more granulosa and thecal cells that a follicle has, it'll just be the larger and more developed, the more estrogen it will produce in response to luteinizing hormone. As a result of those large follicles producing large amounts of estrogen, you get systemic plasma and estrogen concentrations increasing. So you're just building up a lot of this estrogen, which follows this classic negative feedback loop where you get high concentrations of estrogen, which stimulates your hypothalamus and pituitary to stop producing the GnRH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, because we've got a lot of estrogen. But it's like sort of this catch-22. These large tertiary follicles require those hormones to grow and survive. So what happens is when they get a decline because of all this estrogen, that leads most of them to die. But typically, one will survive, and this one now becomes called the dominant follicle. And it will survive the reproduction and follicle stimulating hormone, and this one will be the one that releases a secondary oocyte. When only one dominant follicle remains, it begins to secrete estrogen by itself. It produces so much estrogen that this normal negative feedback doesn't occur. Instead, these extremely high concentrations of estrogen trigger a switch in the anterior pituitary that responds by now suddenly secreting large amounts of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. This is now a positive, so it switches from a negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop, where more estrogen triggers the release of more luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and it only occurs at this point in the cycle. It's this large burst of luteinizing hormone, which we call the luteinizing hormone surge, that leads to ovulation of the dominant follicle. This surge also triggers proteases, which are enzymes, ASE by the way, enzymes that cleave proteins to break down structural proteins in the ovary wall on the surface of the bulging dominant follicle. That degradation of the wall, combined with pressure from the large fluid-filled antrum, results in the expulsion of the oocytes surrounded by the granulosa cells into the peritoneal cavity, and that is called ovulation. Okay, so then we get ovulated into what are called the uterine tubes. They're also called the fallopian tubes or the oviducts, and they serve as the conduit of the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. Each of those two tubes is close to, but not directly connected to the ovary, and it's divided into sections. The first is the isthmus. It's the narrow medial end of each uterine tube, and it's connected to the uterus. The wide distal infundibulum flares out with slender finger-like projections called fimbriae. And then the middle region of the tube, called the ampulla, is where fertilization often occurs. That's where the sperm and the egg cell meet. So how do the egg cells get to where they need to go? Because they don't have flagella. What you get is that these high concentrations of estrogen that occur around the time of ovulation, it induces contractions of your smooth muscle along the uterine tube, and that, along with a whole bunch of cilia that are those hair-like projections coming out of cells, beat and move the oocyte down the tube. Like I said, sperm will typically meet the egg while it's moving through the ampulla. If sperm does meet the egg and it's successfully fertilized, the resulting zygote will begin to divide into 2 cells, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on as it makes its way through the uterine tube and into the uterus. There it will implant and continue to grow. If the egg is not fertilized, it will simply degrade at this point, either in the uterine tube or in the uterus, where it might be shed with the next menstrual period. Okay, let's talk about the uterus and cervix. The uterus is the muscular organ that nourishes and supports a growing embryo. It has 3 sections. The portion of the uterus that is superior to the opening of the uterine tubes is called the fundus. The middle section of the uterus is called the body or the corpus. And the cervix is the narrow inferior portion of the uterus that projects into the vagina. The cervix produces mucus secretions that actually become thin and stringy under the influence of high systemic plasma estrogen, and these secretions can facilitate sperm movement through the reproductive tract. The wall of the uterus is made up of 3 layers. The most superficial layer is called the serous membrane, and it consists of epithelial tissue that covers the exterior portion of the uterus. The middle layer, or myometrium, is a thick layer of smooth muscle responsible for uterine contractions. Most of the uterus is actually myometrial tissue, and the muscle fibers will run horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, and that allows for these powerful contractions that occur during labor, and also the less powerful contractions that we get during menstruation called cramps. The innermost layer of the uterus is called the endometrium, and the endometrium contains a connective tissue lining, the lamina propria, which is covered by epithelial tissue and it lines the lumen. Structurally, the endometrium consists of two layers, the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis, the basal and the functional layers. The stratum basalis layer is part of the lamina propria. It's adjacent to the myometrium, and this layer does not shed during menstruation. However, the one that's more important to remember is the thicker stratum functionalis layer that contains the glandular portion of the lamina propria and the endothelial tissue that lines the uterine lumen. It is the stratum functionalis that grows and thickens in response to all of this estrogen and progesterone that's in our system at this point. It is the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Special branches off of the uterine artery called spiral arteries supply the thickened stratum functionalis. This layer provides the proper site of implantation for the fertilized egg, and if fertilization does not occur, it's the only stratum that it's only the stratum functionalis layer of the endometrium that will shed during menstruation. Let's talk about menstruation, or menses. Remember, during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, the tertiary follicles are going to be growing and secreting estrogen. At the same time that's happening, the stratum functionalis is thickening to prepare for potential implantation. That post-ovulatory increase in progesterone, which is basically characterizing the luteal phase, is key for maintaining that thick stratum functionalis. As long as the functional corpus luteum is present in the ovary, the endometrial lining is prepared for implantation. If an embryo implants, signals get sent to the corpus luteum to continue secreting progesterone so that we can maintain this thick endometrium and maintain the pregnancy. But if an embryo does not implant, no signal is sent to the corpus luteum, it begins to degrade, it ceases progesterone production, and it ends the luteal phase. Without progesterone, the endometrium thins, and under the influence of prostaglandins, the spiral arteries of the endometrium constrict and rupture, preventing oxygenated blood from reaching the endometrial tissue, and as a result, that tissue dies, and blood, pieces of that tissue, and white blood cells are shed through the vagina during menstruation. The first menstruation after puberty is called the menarche, and that can occur either before or after first ovulation. Okay, let's talk about this menstrual cycle. It is a series of changes in which the uterine lining is shed, rebuilt, and prepares for implantation. Well, there's three phases. The Menses phase, or of the menstrual cycle, is the phase during which the lining is shed. That's the days that the woman menstruates. Although it averages approximately 5 days, it can last anywhere from 2 to 7 days, even longer. Once menstrual flow ceases, the endometrium begins to proliferate again, marking the beginning of what is called the proliferative phase of the menstrual cycle. In the uterus, progesterone from the corpus luteum begins the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle, in which the endometrial lining prepares for implantation again, and you can see that this is a cycle. If no implantation occurs within 10 to 12 days, the corpus luteum will degrade, and levels of both estrogen and progesterone will fall, the endometrium grows thinner, and all this happens. We shed again, we go through menstruation again, and we start the cycle again the next day. Almost done here. We're talking about the breasts now. The breasts, although they are much farther away from the rest of the system, they are considered accessory organs of the female reproductive system. The function of the breasts is to supply milk to an infant in a process called lactation. You have a nipple that is surrounded by a pigmented areola. Breast milk is produced by what are called mammary glands. They are modified sweat glands. The milk itself exits the breast through the nipple via what are called 15 to 20 lactiferous ducts that open up on the surface of the nipple. Those lactiferous ducts each extend to a lactiferous sinus that connects to a glandular lobe within the breast itself that contains groups of milk secreting cells in clusters called alveoli. And then lastly, how do we not talk about hormonal birth control? I'm sure most of the females are very familiar with this, so but it's still something for everyone to look at. Birth control pills take advantage of the negative feedback system that regulates the ovarian and menstrual cycles to stop ovulation and prevent pregnancy. Typically, how they work is you take the pill and it provides a constant level of both estrogen and progesterone, which, remember, when you have high levels, it should negatively feed back to your hypothalamus and pituitary and prevent follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Without FSH, follicles don't mature, and without that LH surge, ovulation doesn't occur. However, what this means is that missing even one day can cause ovulation. Although the estrogen and birth control pills does stimulate some thickening of the endometrial wall, it's much reduced compared to what you would get with a normal cycle, and it's less likely to support implantation. Some birth control pills contain 21 active pills, which have hormones, and 7 like basically sugar pills or placebos. The decline in hormones during the week that the woman will take the placebo pills might trigger menstruation, although it will be typically a lighter menstruation than a normal one because there's reduced endometrial thickening. There are some newer types of birth control pills that have been developed that will basically deliver low dose estrogens and progesterones for the entire cycle, and you have to take these every single day for 365 days a year, and you never get menses to occur. Some women will prefer to have the proof of a lack of pregnancy, like menstruation is, but menstruation every 28 days is not required for health reasons, and there are no reported adverse effects of not having a menstrual period in an otherwise healthy individual. Okay, guys, with that, I will see you in the next one.